is Danielle. I'm the Director of Managed Care Readiness Initiatives at IAPRIS. And along with our other MCTAC partners from the Coalition and AFAP, we're happy to say that we have the presenters from our How to Talk to Your Board of Directors about the changes in the healthcare system office hours with us today, Bob Ross and Peter Beichman. And we had such a great turnout a couple of weeks ago that we didn't have time to answer all of your questions. So we'll have the opportunity to do that today. And in addition to answering those questions, you can use the chat box to communicate with our presenters today and ask them any questions. Okay. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available at the MCTAC website. And just as a reminder, the MCTAC site is chock full of information, so you should take a look at it periodically if you don't already do so. And in addition to that, you can sign up for their listserv to receive the weekly MCTAC Digest, and that'll give you lots of information about upcoming events and updates on what's going on in the managed care world. Okay, so you're probably already all familiar with the next slide. What is MCTAC? MCTAC offers training and technical assistance to all of the mental health and substance use providers in New York State. And the next slide shows you all of the MCTAC partners. And then this slide shows you all of the Small Business Initiative partners. And the Small Business Initiative offers training and technical assistance to providers across the state who may not have much experience billing Medicaid, and we help with managed care readiness. And the MCTAC site has a link on it for the Small Business Initiative where you can find slides from our forums, as well as the slides from the webinar about how to talk to your board of directors about changes in the healthcare system. And then all of our upcoming webinars will also be posted there. Okay, so before we jump into the question and answered section, I'd like to just review the suggestions that our presenters offered in the webinar a couple of weeks ago. So that was a very informative webinar. The end of it was the strategies that our presenters asked you to consider when talking to your board of directors. So forming small groups of board members to become educated in a particular topic, whether that be district, value-based payment, HCBS, and have the group report and update the full board. Using resources that can present to the board for education, whether that be OMH or OASS field office staff, or advocacy groups or coalitions. Using the MCTAC Managed Care Language Guide as a glossary, because there are so many acronyms and new terms. And if they're knowledgeable and you're comfortable with them, to use your senior management staff to do some educating. Creating an agenda item and setting time aside each board meeting for updates on behavioral health and healthcare reform. And then using the idea of a strategic planning initiative for your board. Okay, so I think that we can start with some of the questions. And as a reminder, just use your chat box to send in your questions. Okay, so let's get started. The first question that we had left over from our previous webinar was to how to solicit more involvement from voluntary board members. So Peter and Bob, you can take it away.
So I think the involvement issue is an interesting one from the following perspective. It's not so much a question of how much information that individual board members need to catch up on around all the important issues that are changing in our field. It's that, but even more important, I think it's what the broader perspective of their roles are changing as board members. And what I mean by that is I think that board members historically in many not-for-profit boards have felt that if they were conversant with the mission and performance of the agency, and if that was working fairly well, then there was not necessarily a need for them to absorb what management needed to absorb in what was happening in the external environment. I think that has changed dramatically. I think for boards to do their job really well, individual board members and boards as a whole need to have a much better big picture understanding of the broader issues that are impacting the field so that they can then do their due diligence in helping their individual agencies chart through these changing and sometimes uncertain waters. So I think it's not so much a question of learning a whole lot of specific information alone, although I think there is specific information on value-based payments, on managed care, regulations, et cetera. But the most important part is, how do some of those things fit into the mission of their agency, and what is their bigger picture view of their responsibilities in light of those changes? And let me flip it to you, Peter, to see if you have other thoughts that you want to add on that question.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with what Bob has said. And we did talk the last time about a lot of issues and a lot of new concepts and new initiatives that are part of the overall. But I do agree that for boards, the big picture is very important. And some board members, you know, will be motivated by the impact on clients and client services. Some board members will be motivated by the financial changes that are taking place. So different board members can be kind of engaged in different aspects of what's happening, but it is this larger overall picture, I think, that the board needs to understand, and from a strategic perspective, to work with management to plan how to respond to all the changes.
I would just add quickly to what Peter just said, that the fact that from my perspective, having served on many boards as well as having served in management positions, it's never a good goal for the board to micromanage, but sometimes there's a good tension that boards and management need to work out, where they sort out the amount of information that's useful for the board to receive, and that management in turn can benefit enormously from perspectives that the board brings, and neither of those require necessarily moving into that area that I think is always dangerous, which is when boards, out of concern or feeling uncomfortable, accidentally wind up micromanaging what are traditionally appropriate decisions for management. And I think this is equally true now as at any other point in time. When the boards are trying to figure out how to absorb more information on these bigger issues, there could be a tendency on the part of some board members to accidentally get into micromanaging some of the small details that aren't really the board's purview and don't really help organizations. So as Peter suggested a couple minutes ago, there are going to be individual differences in the way board members react to the current circumstances, and I think it's probably helpful for the relationship between management and the boards to acknowledge that not every single board member is going to react the same, and to do their best to understand that that dynamic is going to be different with different board members.
Okay, thank you. So the next question. Do the speakers feel that small agencies need to merge to survive VBP? Are there other options? And how do we introduce affiliation to?
Peter, you want to start on that one and I'll follow up?
Yes, I'll start on that one, and then Bob can follow. I know that there has been some basic education done on VBP, and what we said at the last session was that, of course, VBP switches the basis of payment from fee-for-service to quality, efficiency, effectiveness, performance, and metrics. VBP is, it's a complicated environment, and there is a movement, a statewide movement, and in fact, OMH is playing an active role in encouraging partnerships of agencies to work together in the VBP environment. And that can be either informally through affiliations and partnerships, or it can be more formally done through the creation of independent practice associations, IPAs. But it's also not to say that an individual agency can't participate and thrive in a VBP environment. And what, I would encourage everyone to take advantage of the VBP education efforts that OMH and others are making. So that, you are all well informed and can decide whether, again, to reach toward the partnership kind of approach or the IPA approach, or to the solo agency in the environment. Bob?
Yeah, I would just add two quick things to that. One, in terms of the last question or last part of that question, how do you introduce affiliation to the boards? I think the dialogue there is that there will not be organizations of any size in any region that shouldn't be having conversations between the boards and the and management around affiliation. That should become a frequent point of discussion, both for VBP and for many other of the changes that are going on. And I would suggest that each board try and come up with, along with their management teams, a language that makes sense. An example of that is that a number of organizations that I'm familiar with use the term strategic partnering. So it's sort of a dynamic process, not just a strategic plan, which can be somewhat static. And it doesn't assume that things remain the same over a long period of time. So the dialogue between management and boards is pretty frequent, and probably at most, if not every board meeting, there's some discussion about what types of affiliations are underway, what types of affiliations should be embarked on, and what are the outcomes of some of those conversations and initiatives.
Okay, thank you. So our next question is, for agencies that have semi-active boards, how do program administrators ignite awareness and necessity of activation during this changing landscape? What topics are best to begin with, and how do we wake up our board?
I'll take a first shot at that, Peter. I think the solution to this question is not unlike the solution to many board-related questions, and that is for management and the board chairs to find ways of creating champions within the board who are more comfortable than the board members as a whole, or more comfortable than some of the semi-active board members. It's really useful for board members who get it earlier or are more interested in the issue to be asked to step up and help the rest of the board as a whole. It doesn't always have to be the board chair. It can be somebody else, but it's useful for the board chair to be supportive of that initiative. And I think that the dialogue between the management team and key members of the board, some boards, for example, have very active executive committees, which can be one way of approaching that. There can be a particular existing committee that's not necessarily the executive committee that may have an easy leadership role to extend in this area. But I think it's like most things. It's a question of understanding, as Peter so aptly put in the seminar, in the webinar last time, really understanding where your board is at in the beginning of this process and using the resources and the strengths that already exist.
Peter, do you want
Peter, are you still on?
We may have lost him. If we can move on, we'll get it back. The next question is, are there any resources that you can recommend for boards to consult with?
Hello?
Go ahead, Bob. I hear you.
We're on question 4.
That's right, about resources for boards to consult with.
Well, we've talked a little bit in the earlier session about using advocacy groups and regional coalitions. I think both of those are very valuable. There also are some what I would call non-traditional groups that may be useful. For example, there are responsibilities that individuals have who work in county government that are important for many boards in individual counties that are operational. And sometimes, dialoguing with individuals from those county groups can be extremely helpful. County executives and their teams have to make budgets, and many of those budgets are supportive of individual agencies that operate within their jurisdiction. And that's a dialogue that I think is frequently overlooked. County budgets are important and difficult to anticipate where they can be expanded in terms of resources, but sometimes it might be helpful for those groups to understand some of the challenges that the individual agencies are looking to address. And there also are some really excellent board training organizations that are not-for-profit. Some of them don't require expending large consulting fees to access. So I would suggest that management teams and boards take a look at a full range of resources, some of which may not be particularly difficult to engage and not require large consulting commitments.
Great. Hi, this is Peter. I'm back.
Oh, good. Glad you're back.
Hi, and with apologies, everyone. I did hear Bob's response to the question, and I don't think I have anything to add to that one.
You want to take number 5 here?
Yeah, I'll take number 5. Number 5 asks about informing government officials, local government boards where there are county-operated services. And I guess there's a little bit of a special concern here because elected officials, make policy as well as control part of the purse strings in what gets spent. So, but I think in terms of, again, educating the local government folks where it's necessary, I think, again, I think the big place to start is for them to understand how the service system is changing in particular ways that impact their operations, and those would be the movement to manage care, and the value-based environment. So I think that educating the local officials, the county supervisors, on the big picture, is the place to begin with them.
And I would just add two very specific points to what Peter just said. One is most county boards of supervisors have committees, and some of those committees are very relevant to what we're talking about in terms of service delivery. They could be a broader human service committee. They could be something more specific in some of the bigger counties that might be specific to a particular area like mental health or substance abuse or a combination. But those committees are where a lot of work gets done. And I would suggest that in addition to trying to talk to the board as a whole, going to the committees that are most relevant and have maybe a little bit more time and can go a little bit deeper would be useful. The other thing that can be extremely helpful is that it's been my experience that government officials at the county level and elsewhere very often are held captive to their own very cursory understanding of what's reported in the media, and some of that can be misleading and most of it can be incomplete. So on any issue that's really important, it may be useful to start out by asking what their understanding of some of these issues are, because it may be that there are some significant misunderstandings or some very superficial understandings, and without criticizing their knowledge base at the starting point, it's extremely useful for them to get access to experts who have more information than they may be getting from the general media.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the last question that we had from our first webinar is this one. As a housing provider with OMH congregate treatment and treatment departments, and as a safety net provider now offering HCBS, it was suggested by our Association of Community Living to sign contracts with MCOs now, even though the contracts are not negotiable, in order to allow the managed care organizations to get to know us and for us to get to know them. So in case sometime in the future we may end up receiving referrals from the hospitals directly and receive payments based on our ability to provide housing and supports to individuals of high need or cost to Medicaid. Do you agree that residential providers should sign contracts at this time, and why?
So I'll start with that one. I definitely agree with the ACL suggestion. Let's remember that it is the vision, the state's vision, that Medicaid payments in the residential system and supportive service payments in the residential system ultimately will be brought into managed care. So I think that it is a very good idea to work with the managed care companies if you're a residential provider now, to introduce yourself and to contract with the understanding that as the reforms play out through district, work with PPSs, that residential services are a key component of social determinants that will be brought into the system, if not very soon, at least at some point over the next few years.
I couldn't agree with Peter more. I would just suggest that it's probably to any provider's benefit to do the get-to-know part before you do the sign part. The idea of signing contracts and being involved early is an extremely helpful one, and I think I would encourage that as well as what Peter said. But I'd also suggest that the get-to-know part doesn't require signing anything to initiate that. And the value of that is that some of the managed care companies are much more open than we might think to understanding things that they don't now understand as well. So one of the functions there is not just to get to participate, but to get to influence them about some of the things that we've thought about more than they have in our areas, and get them to understand those before the contracts actually are signed on both sides.
And one of the ways to proceed on the get-to-know part is one thing that I've seen that's been very effective is agencies putting together simple binders that describe the services they provide, that describe any special expertise that they have, so that you can, in a get-to-know meeting, you can present to an MCO a kind of a pretty full picture of what you do, who you serve, and any kind of specialized services that you provide in addition to the regular services.
In that last point that Peter was just making, it's a great opportunity for providers to start to explain to the managed care organizations what their value added is, both in terms of their specific agency and across an area that the managed care companies may not have really thought much about. What you do is important for the managed care companies to understand, but how you do it and why it's important for outcomes and how it really affects the ability of the managed care companies to determine what is of specific increased value to them is a terrific opportunity.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. So we're going to take a minute and go through some questions. Feel free to chat in your questions using the chat box. And we are just going to take about 1 minute to see what questions have come in, and we'll be right back with you. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. This one is, there's a fine line between sharing too much information and too little. How do you decide when to stop?
I think the answer to that question is yes.
Yeah, I agree. The answer is definitely yes. And I think it's up to a sensitive executive to kind of have that sixth sense about when is enough and when is it too much.
Like many important dialogues, I think the answer to that seriously winds up being the assumption is that whatever is initially tried is probably not what's going to wind up being the final solution, and that both the boards and the management teams should feel comfortable doing a little of experimenting. So maybe at one board meeting a certain amount of level of detail is provided, and then honest feedback is provided by the board to say, you know, that was not quite enough or that was too much. And there's a rhythm that you want to reach, and that rhythm is going to be unique to every single board and to every configuration of individuals. But I would encourage both the boards and the management teams to not be uncomfortable doing a little experimenting and being honest with each other about that was too much or that wasn't enough.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, this has been helpful, and I had a number of board members attend the 11:15 call. Is there a formal presentation that we could send to board members that weren't present? Is there a similar training that could be made available for staff regarding all of the changes occurring in New York State? So I can actually answer that question for you, and the answer is yes. That 11:15 webinar was posted on the MCTAC website. So you can certainly go through those slides with your board members, and there has been some interest in getting some training or technical assistance around board development, and we're looking into putting something together for that. And you or your board members should feel free to reach out to me at daniela.l@niapos.org, and we can talk about that. And there are lots of resources on the MCTAC website about educating staff regarding the changes in New York State. There's one document in particular that's on the MCTAC website that's called Practical Facts about the changes in our healthcare system, and that I think would be a great place to start. One other question for Bob and Peter. In the previous webinar, you suggest using managers to educate your boards. In what ways can they help?
I think what we were kind of saying there was if you as an executive have a director of finance who really understands and can explain and educate the board, for example, on managed care, the way managed care reimbursement works, etc. That, you know, certainly would be appropriate. If you have someone who is, you know, heading up your HCBS services, for example, someone who's coordinating that program, who is well-versed and who you think can communicate well with the board, then that person could make that presentation to the board. I guess what we were suggesting in that strategy was that not all of the education has to be done by the executive, but that the executive who knows the management team well can make judgments about whether other members of the team can work with the board on the educational efforts around these areas.
I would add one quick piece to that is that frequently boards do a lot of their work in committees. So if you take what Peter just said and apply it to the fact that there may be in any given board a committee or two in which this issue or series of issues is looked at more intensely than the board has time to do as a whole, exactly what Peter said may be applicable to those resources being used at the working meetings of the various different committees. That could be particularly helpful. And in either context, whether as a committee or as a board as a whole, one of the things that can be very useful is for the knowledgeable experts, as Peter was describing it, within the organization, not just the executive director or CEO, to provide a list of the serious and important questions on these issues that management is contending with. Sometimes it's very helpful to set the table, not just to provide the answers. And I think a board is well educated when it understands the range of issues that are being looked at, not necessarily just limited to what are the solutions that are being proposed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one more question. Can you speak more about collaboration? We don't want to lose our identity, but we need to try to convince our board that partnering is a good thing.
Go ahead, Bob, on that one.
Sure. I had used the term strategic partnering earlier in one of the other answers, and I would bring it up again here. The history of many boards in many good organizations and many effective boards has been that it has not been a requirement of the boards to necessarily understand the context if an individual agency was doing quite well in its work. I think that's basically history at this point. I think all boards, as part of their due diligence, are going to need to understand the context in which their individual agencies operate. So I would suggest that although it may not be immediately received with loud applause, the challenge, when done well by management to the board to understand that in the best interests of the organization, different kinds of affiliations are going to be needed in the future, and that that's a departure necessarily from what's existed in the past. And it's true from small agencies all the way up to hospitals. I mean, you don't have to be a consumer of detailed information about the field to understand that hospital affiliations are happening in very different and creative ways that have not historically been the case. And small agencies collaborating either with other small agencies or big agencies is happening much more often. So the education that I think is really necessary to say is that's the new norm. Affiliations are the new norm. The specifics are going to be dependent upon information that's going to vary enormously from agency to agency. But I would say that very few, if any, boards can do their job well if part of the dialogue at most, if not every board meeting, isn't including what are we doing differently and what are we considering doing differently in terms of affiliations. And I think board members will come to understand that even if they don't necessarily fully grasp it at the first time or two that it's raised.
And I think the term affiliations doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we're having a full legal merger and losing our identity or creating a new identity with a merged entity. There are all sorts and levels of affiliation that are more informal. There are memorandums of understanding among providers. And one of the things that's emerging, of course, in DSRIP, as DSRIP will wind down in year 5, is that many of the PPSs are going to continue as a shared network of services in their communities. And that's an instance of affiliations that will, we think, be very important in the future. So to the degree that your organization is participating in PPSs now, again, that is those are the kind of roots of what will be some important affiliation opportunities as things unfold.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions. We can give folks another minute or so for the last minute questions to come in. So let's take a short minute break and see if we get any other questions. In the meantime, I want to thank you, Peter and Bob, for talking with us and answering all of our questions today. And I want to remind listeners on the phone that we are working on more webinars, and we are actually in the planning process of a risk management webinar for December. So be on the lookout for notices about that. And it looks like we don't have anything else coming in. Peter and Bob, did you have any last minute words of wisdom for us?
I'd like to just add one point going back to the beginning of the first session. And I think that the opportunity of asking the board on the part of the management team what they think may be some areas related to these broad topics that they've heard about, don't quite understand completely, would like to know more about, is also an important piece. I don't think the burden should be completely on the part of the management team to go and do the presentation. I think they should also solicit from the boards and their individual board members what are areas and what are specifics that they think they'd like to know more about.
And I'll just say, I think overall in the webinar, what we've tried to do is indicate how important it is right now to develop meaningful dialogue and work with boards with all of the changes that are going on in the system. And just that we hope that you've found it valuable as a discussion and will consider some of the strategies that we outlined, as well as share some new ones with us when you come up with some. I'm sure Daniela at MCTAC would love to hear some additional creative ideas.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. And thank you again, Bob. It looks like we don't have any more questions, so we're going to go ahead and end today's office hours. Thanks so much for all of our participants that came today and asked questions and listened. And one more special thank you to Peter and Bob. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye now.